Welcome, everyone, to our program, Truth, Trust, and Turnout, Navigating Elections, Civic Engagement, and Disinformation. We'd like you to consider membership in AAUW Jane Addams branch. You can be a dual member if you're already a branch member of another AAUW branch. We can provide you membership information, and you can get a discount on membership when you join after a program. During the program, use the chat window for any questions or technical issues. We will take all the questions and answer them at the end. Please remember to stay muted during the program because we are recording the program, and that recording will be posted on the Jane Addams website following the program in about a week. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Suzanne M. Chod. She is a professor of political science, coordinator of gender and sexuality studies, and director of the Center for Social Impact at North Central College in Naperville. She received her BS in political science from Bowling Green University. She received a PhD in political science from Michigan State University. Her interests include American political institutions and civic engagement of young people. She has written several books, one being Technology and Civic Engagement in the College Classroom, Engaging the Unengaged. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Suzanne.
There we go. Can everyone hear me okay? I could get some nods if we can hear me. Okay,
Yes.
wonderful. Thank you all so much for having me tonight, Elaine, in particular, for reaching out. I'm really excited to get a chance to present this information. Some of you I may have met or have seen me when I gave the presentation at the state convention a few months back. And so I just appreciate having a different audience this time to talk about something that's so critically important. So what I will do is go ahead and share my screen here. Just give me one moment. Okay. Is everyone able to see? What wonderful. Okay. So one of the things that when Elaine and I were first speaking about getting the program together and thinking about what day to do it, today, for those of you who don't know or have heard about it, today's Constitution Day. It's also National Voter Registration Day. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to talk about the importance of being equipped with facts and evidence to make informed decisions, but also to help nip false narratives in the bud. We are all in conversation with people where mis and disinformation spreads, where there's a disagreement over where facts lie, and so knowing how to have conversations with people who disagree with you and engage with people who are maybe coming across in conversation without facts and evidence. Some of that we'll talk about today and have some tips towards the end. But today of all days, when it's National Voter Registration Day and Constitution Day, it felt like the perfect time to talk about the importance of facts. So what we'll do this evening, and here, let me try this again. Here we go. We'll start with kind of where are we as a nation? And I'll walk through this in some detail, particularly things about public trust and polarization. And then talking about what are the stakes? Who are the players that are driving the polarization, how they're using mis and disinformation to drive that polarization, and how dangerous that is for certain communities. And I'll give a very relevant example from just within the past week as we walk through that. And then I want to leave the conversation or end it with what is our responsibility? So we are active and engaged and sophisticated voters and citizens that care very much about our democracy, and we want others to care about our democracy. And part of that care then means that we need to take the time to not only have the facts, but then to engage with others who do not. And there's ways in which we can do that meaningfully and effectively. And then we'll have some time, as Elaine said, for questions at the end. And I very much look forward to that dialogue afterwards. So let's start with where we are. One of the things that really is important in terms of starting the conversation is public trust in government. So I'll be showing a lot of data from the Pew Research Center, which is a center that's run by social scientists. That is at the top of the game, top of the field of getting information, particularly about politics and where people sit. So one of the things that you might notice here is a very high level of public trust in the 1960s. And as we move into the 1970s with Watergate and Vietnam and the counterculture movement, we see this stark decrease in public trust. And then it kind of goes up and down a bit over time, and you can sort of see the historical markers of why that would be the case. But we see a sharp decrease after 9/11 and the tumult that comes through the country really in the past 20 years. And we can see how it's been this sharp decrease. And even though it goes up a bit, we see that it goes back down again and it ends quite low. And so the question, of course, is why do we have such low trust in government? And so really the answer to this question is about polarization. And so this is a term that we hear a lot, that there's this relationship between how much we trust the government, how legitimate we think the government is, and based on what side of the aisle you sit and how far on the side of the aisle you sit, you have higher or lower trust in government, feel that it's more or less legitimate. And if your party's in control of government, you might have more trust, and if it's not, you have less. The defining feature of our political system in the 21st century is polarization. And we hear this word a lot, but what I want to add to the conversation is that it's not just about being sorted into two different parties because of policy preferences. It's that plus being extreme. So the extremity in the positions and particularly in the rhetoric about the other party and the other side and talking about the other party as the enemy. You can be polarized and feel differently about issues, but you don't have to be extreme in how far away you are and then how you talk about the other side. And so it's that sort of cocktail of polarization and extremity that is so dangerous. And that's where we sit. And so I want to look at this with, again, indulge me in the data. These data come from the New York Times, and it's looking at polarization, measures of polarization across the world, because we focus here so much on the level of polarization in the United States, and that's what I study. But it's interesting to look at it in comparison to other parts of the world. And we can see that polarization isn't a uniquely US problem because it's happened across the world. But how polarized we are and how quickly it has increased and how steep that increase has been is something that's uniquely US. And again, that part of the answer to that is the extremity, right? How far apart we are and how we feel about those on the other side. And if we look at this increase from the 1980s, but again, this real stark increase since 2000, and we put this up against the data I just showed about public trust, you see a really clear pattern that has polarization increased in the United States, particularly since 2000. We've seen public trust in government decrease. The farther away we are, the worse we talk about one another, the less we talk to one another, the more polarized we are, and then the less trust we have in government, and the less legitimate we see the government. And again, this while this pattern goes across party, it's also important to look at what we say about one another in party and across party in terms of trusting in them. So there's some interesting data here, again, to sort of note, and I'll show this in two places here. So for example, and this comes from Pew again, 21% of Republicans and those who tend to vote Republican consistently say that the Democratic Party respects U.S. democratic institutions and traditions. Only 21% say basically that the other side even respects U.S. democracy. And then 14% of Republicans and leaners say that the Democratic Party governs honestly and ethically. It's a very, very small percentage. But it's not just Republicans saying that about Democrats. it's, excuse me here, my clicker, excuse me, sorry about that. We see, looking at it the other way, it's almost a mirror image, where 24% of Democrats and leaners say that the Republican Party respects democratic institutions, and 16% say that the Republican Party governs honestly and ethically. It's not a unique problem to one party. This is what defines our political system right now. And because we're so divided, and because we have this narrative about whether we can trust the government, and particularly trust members of the government of the other side, there are those that we call the disruptors. These are actors in our governmental system that are driving the distance between the parties, capitalizing on the distance between the parties, and in particular are using falsehoods and mis and disinformation to erode trust. And there's a political scientist from Harvard named Thomas Patterson who studies American politics. And he wrote a book, and I have the citation that I'm happy to provide, called How America Lost Its Mind. And one of the things that he says about these disruptors is that they want to sow confusion and discord. They want to mar the reputation of political leaders, undermine faith in the country's political institutions, and raise doubts about the accuracy of the news media. These are what we talk about here, what he's talking about are the most important parts of our democracy, right? It's our leaders, it's our institutions, and it's the media. And these disruptors, these are elected officials, these are also thought leaders and elites who are dividing us on purpose. And the way they are doing it is to make us outraged. I'll talk in a little bit about the way that emotion plays a part in our participation in our democratic process. And because we're so far apart and because we don't trust the government, these disruptors come in and they capitalize on that by trying to make us more mad at each other and mad at the system. And as this sort of graphic denotes here, it's all about outrage and evoking emotion in order to get a particular political end. So it could be to win an election or to have policy change, but it's purposefully divisive. And this is especially done using social media. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move along. This idea of fake news and the way that it spreads, while this can happen on all mediums, it is most likely to occur on social media. And so it's important to kind of understand the way which that works. And Thomas Patterson, again, he talks about Hannah Arendt in his book, and he says, for her quote here, people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. And what Hannah Arendt is talking about is that's how we slide into authoritarianism. That when this happens and when it's done purposefully, we are in danger of sliding into an authoritarian system. I'm not suggesting that's where we are, but what I am suggesting is that there is an intentional effort to mar the distinction between fact and fiction, and that we really don't know what's true or false anymore. And that there is, again, a purposeful way that we do this in order to have some kind of political end. And so I want to just quickly kind of talk about the difference between mis and disinformation. So often we hear about misinformation. And the graphic here kind of gives this description. Misinformation is something that you think is true. You're not spreading information that you know is false. It's something that you do think is true, but it turns out that it's not. There's not necessarily an intent to divide. There's not even necessarily an intent to deceive. It's often accidental, often. Disinformation is what we're seeing more and more of, and is what's the most dangerous, which is, you know that it's not true. It's either been made up, you made it up yourself. Given the facts, you know it's not factually accurate, but you say it anyway. And I would argue, as other political scientists have done, that disinformation is actually the most dangerous. And we are now seeing a significant shift from misinformation to disinformation. And in particular, the data are very clear that disinformation spreads 10 times faster than true reporting because of going viral on social media and sharing, and also because we sort of see these little echo chambers we end up in social media where we're only consuming content that confirms our biases. And if someone's, put something on social media that confirms your bias, even if maybe you know it's not factually accurate, you still believe it to be true because it confirms those biases, and you're going to share it. And so one of the examples we often point to, if we go back to 2016, is Pizzagate. Some of you might be familiar with Pizzagate, which was the conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton in particular, and the Democratic Party more generally, was running a child pedophile ring out of a pizza place in New York. It caused someone who lived in South Carolina to drive up to the pizza place and come in armed because he was convinced that if he opened the door to the basement, there would be children who were there. And this person was arrested and so forth. But what I'd like to just bring up is the more recent example that President Trump brought up in the debate last week about Haitian immigrants eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. This has been debunked over and over and over again. Even before President Trump talked about it at the debate, we've seen J.D. Vance and others double down on this language and this rhetoric. And we've seen the detrimental effects on the community in Springfield, both Haitian immigrants and everyone in the community. And we know that this isn't true, but it confirms a narrative that suggests that that immigrants are dangerous. And so for those people who believe that that's true, even though this information is not true, they're going to share it and swear that it is. It's really, really damaging and dangerous and spreads really, really fast. And the stakes are high for us to do something about it. The stakes are, of course, very high for the communities being affected by it. So who engages in this behavior? Well, we call these people the performers. These typically are elected officials who benefit from sowing discontent and division. And they do this by invoking emotion. So, for example, there's an anxiety that exists in the country or in a particular pocket of the population. It's either a latent anxiety or it's an expressed anxiety. And so what the performers do is they tap into that anxiety and they confirm it, right? And they say, I see you, I understand you and your plight. But what they do then is activate that anxiety into fear. And not just fear of protecting oneself or one's way of life, but in doing so, it's also being afraid of others who might be coming to take those things away from you. And so what happens then is that fear is then transformed and activated into anger. So you go from anxiety to fear activation to anger. And not just anger that I might be losing something that's important, but directing that anger at someone or some group or groups. And what the data show, the research shows very clearly, and I think we see this in our own lives, is that anger drives behavior more than any other type of emotion. And politics and voting is a very emotional process. It sometimes doesn't feel very rational because it's so emotional. So the performers really use this formula and drive it with mis and disinformation to activate this emotion in the electorate and get them to vote in particular ways or act out in particular ways that benefit them. And we can see all kinds of examples that go back, decades, but that we've seen so many in our most recent political times. And all of this emotion, right, to get to anger is really about outrage. And outrage politics is fueled by disinformation. The way we get people to feel that rage and want to do something about it is to continue to confirm their biases, even if it's with disinformation. And so there was a study back in 2021 that asked people, where do they get their news? And then asked them a bunch of political questions, so fact-based questions. And what this shows here is that 45%, so like people that get most of their news online, so online news sources, 45% of them have high political knowledge. So that's good. 31% medium, 23% low. So for the most part, those who are consuming most of their news online and those who are consuming most of their news by listening to the radio and then to some extent print have the highest amount of factual political knowledge. We can see at the bottom that for those people who mostly get their news from social media, only 17% of them are categorized as high political knowledge. And so on the amount of questions, they did it where if you answered, 10 to 7 of them correctly, you were high, and then down and down from there. But 57% of people who get most of their news from social media have what we consider low political knowledge. Now, in and of itself, this may not feel that icky if not most people now are getting their news, are consuming all type of content on social media, right? So even though this is one survey, when we look across at how most people get their news, not looking at whether they have political knowledge, particularly for Gen Z, for the youngest generation, most of them are getting their news on social media, and in particular, getting their news on TikTok. For older generations like mine and others, Facebook tends to be the place where it happens. And we know that Facebook is a place where disinformation spreads wildly. And so because a lot of people are getting their news from social media, they ought to have low levels of political knowledge. And this is where this can get really dicey with disinformation. So as we transition to talking a little bit more about what are the consequences, all of this I've discussed so far, this outrage politics fueled by disinformation, all it does is get us deeper and deeper into our teams. We talk about our partisanship now as tribalism, that we are so far apart and so extreme. And we use this word calcification. So we think about something that's very sticky and inflexible, that now, regardless of who the candidate is, if you agree with their policies or all of their policies, it's just about sticking where you are because the other side, you have been told by disinformation that the other side is the enemy. Even when, and we'll talk about this as we move forward in a minute, you do try to fact check. There has to be sort of the perfect combination of ways to do it, to even try to get someone from the other side to reconsider a position, because we are so deeply calcified in our party. And the more that we engage in outrage politics, and the more that it's fueled by disinformation, the more calcified our politics becomes. So now what? So now I've sort of walked you through the fast version of how we got to where we are, but really it's what is our responsibility as we move forward. We talked about the disruptors, we talked about the performers, but there are other people or other actors that have a part in this that need to take responsibility, and then we need to take responsibility. And so we talk about, Patterson talks about the marketers. So again, this is the political scientist from Harvard who wrote the book, How America Lost Its Mind. And he talks about the marketers. So really, as the graphic denotes, this is the media, right? And so even mainstream news sources that are seen as non-biased as possible and that are trusted, they still want ratings. They want clicks. It's about ad revenue, right? It's about making money for the few media companies that own all of our outlets and online outlets. And they're going to lead with what clicks, even if it is misinformation at first that gets us to read it. And what this does, though, is, and this is something that another political scientist spoke about in the 1980s, where he says, we're losing our sense of what it means to be well-informed. Ignorance is always correctable. So he gives us hope, right? That there are mechanisms and ways for us to correct our ignorance. But he then asks us, what shall we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge? And this is where we are, is we also don't see it as ignorance, because we think that what information we're consuming from the elites that we trust, because it confirms our biases, is the actual truth, even when we're faced with a counterfactual. And the media perpetuates this in ways to make money. And then if we talk about those who are moving out more on the fringe media and those who are social media marketers, who don't have the same kind of journalistic ethics they have to adhere to, that is how they make their living. And that is how they gain popularity. And Laura Loomer, who's circulating right now with President Trump, is an example of this, who also started this rumor, this disinformation campaign about what's going on in Springfield. So knowing that we have the disruptors and the performers and the marketers, what can we do? There's a take-home point here that's important. There's a slew of political scientists and cognitive psychologists and social psychologists who've studied mis and disinformation, fact-checking, what works and what doesn't. And so there's kind of this just how to counteract mis and disinformation. And it's something that we can incorporate into our daily lives and conversations. I do it in the classroom for sure, and in engaging in the public as well. And so I'll go through these one by one. The first one is when you are confronted in conversation with somebody who is spewing mis and disinformation at you, to correct them, you come to them and correct them with a highly credible source. So you don't want to start with, well, my cousin said blah, 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 right? It's, well, I read in this journal, or I saw in this reputable, story. But what's even most important about this is it works best if, let's say, you're a Republican, you identify as a Republican, and you're in conversation with someone who identifies as a Democrat, and they're giving you information that you know is not accurate. Can you counteract their narrative they're giving using information another Democrat has provided, right? So can you find this common space where it's not you from the other side telling them they're wrong? It's like, well, I read that so-and-so Democrat said this, that, and the other. And it's someone they feel a kinship with. So a credible source they can connect to. That's the first step that works very well. The second thing is, rather than simply saying, you're wrong, that's not true, we know better, can you engage in a dialogue that offers a new frame? Getting sort of out of their maybe narrow talking point, and engage in a dialogue that asks them to think about it more broadly. We all know how that goes when someone says something and you just shut them down immediately, right? That's not how we engage and try to elevate discourse. We do have to listen to others. Now, we don't do it in a way that triggers us, that dehumanizes us, right? But we can engage in a conversation so that we can sort of figure out from where they're coming and offer a new frame. And in this, we don't directly challenge one's worldview or identity, right? It's so easy to devolve into a, well, you don't know any better because you're this, that, or the other. Or, well, of course you think that way because you've never done this, that, or the other. When we engage in conversation, we don't challenge a worldview or one's identity. We're all experts in our own identity. We're very protective over those things. And the worldview and our lived experiences. We don't want to challenge that. That's the quickest way to turn off a conversation. And the last thing, which the data suggests is the most important, is to do it on the spot if possible. You can, in a conversation, do it on the spot. So if you see that this false narrative is gaining traction, can you counteract this and try to nip it in the bud on the spot? And it might be that you can't do it right then and there. But if there is a way, especially if it's someone that you engage with regularly and you know you're going to have dialogue with, can you come back in the next conversation and engage in all four of these steps, right? Or can you do all of this at once? But it's all of these things in combination. First of all, this is what the media should be doing. And some outlets do this well and others purposefully do it poorly. But it's our responsibility as committed and educated and thoughtful citizens to try to do what we can to try to break through this calcification by calling out mis and disinformation for what it is, which is a way to continue to divide us and hurt communities. And that is what I've got. So I just want to thank you so much for your time, allowing me, indulging me in my exercise in data and all things civic engagement. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so I can see everyone, and really looking forward to questions.
Well, I think everyone was so focused on the information you presented that I'm not seeing a lot of questions. So I'm going to give them a little time.
Sure.
One comment about Trump's messaging is he's not just saying immigrants are dangerous, but he's doubling down on white fear by targeting other brown-skinned people, perhaps.
No, that's absolutely right. And that was his strategy. That's what got him the nomination in 2016. And it really falls into exactly what was captured in that tapping into anxiety and activating it to fear and into anger. It works to win elections. We call it white grievance. What Trump is doing is tapping into this white grievance. And it is so incredibly dangerous, like physically dangerous for communities of color and minoritized people, particularly this narrative about what's going on in Springfield or what's not going on in Springfield.
Right. The other fear that is mentioned related to immigrants is the idea that so many are coming, they're going to replace the mainstream American group.
That's right.
So that's another aspect of fear.
Yes. We call it the replacement theory. And Tucker Carlson in particular and Fox News and other sort of further right commentators really played into this. And we talk about this replacement and this idea that of what we call white grievance, as I mentioned before. But it's this perception that because the country is becoming less white, less Christian, right? And by the time we get to 2050, those who identify as white will be in the mathematical minority. However, because of power structures, they will still be the majority of voters, right? Like that's an important distinction of who's the mathematical majority in the country and who's going to be the mathematical majority of voters, because voting is power, right? And that's a distinction we can discuss, right? And is important to note. But it doesn't feed the narrative that we need to keep the power because we've always had it. And so we want you to be afraid of losing it. And we're going to feed this fear narrative to control and keep as much power for as long as possible.
Here's a question. Do we know when fake news as a term began?
Yeah, so it was actually first started by Sean Spicer, which was President Trump's first and very short time press secretary. He was the first one to use the term in a consistent way, and it has, and like fake news is real, like that's a real thing. I joke, like my husband will say, like, oh, the meteorologist said it was going to rain today. That's fake news. I'm like, that's actually not what fake news is. And it's like a funny joke that we have at my house. But now what we say is any news we hear or see that that doesn't confirm our biases or we don't think is true, we just push off as fake news, because that's what the first Trump administration engaged in. And that was also where we first heard the term alternative facts. Which is not a real thing. But those two terms really come around in Trump's first term.
Well, on looking at the different generations, I know I've read that a dominant group that might be sharing misinformation on Facebook is senior citizens. And how can we address that? And then a secondary question, how can we engage younger members? So two questions kind of in one related.
Yeah, it's so important because generational differences really do matter for anything related to politics. But in particular, for the older generation their social media platform of choice is Facebook. It's so easy to share things, right? And the news feed and all of that. And the algorithm is so strong that once you like or even just hover over something, then you're going to keep getting things that are just like it. And so it's very tempting, especially if you get something from someone you trust, to presume that it's accurate, and then you share and you share and you share, right? And so the most important thing that we can do is take the extra step to fact check it. You see something and you're like, well, let me just make sure, because I don't know if I think that that's true, or look at the source from where it's coming. That's another thing I tell my students, right? If you see something and someone shares it with you, or you're going through your feed, what is the source from where it's coming? Not the person who shared it, but like the actual source of who composed it, who constructed it. And do a little digging. It takes a little bit longer, right? There's a commitment that we have to make to not being part of the problem. And it just takes a little bit longer to do. And I would say that to any generation, or anyone who consumes social news on social media. So I can stop there. Or I can talk about for young people, Elaine.
A follow-up to that. I've heard that you should not reply to that comment, but when you find out the actual facts, do a separate post, because you don't want to amplify viewers of the thing that triggered you. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And, and I think I would say two things about this. So first of all, yes, absolutely. If you want to do something more public, right, that you want to start something new so it doesn't, to your point, amplify the false narrative. But the other thing is that it gives you an opportunity to have a dialogue, like I just mentioned, with the person that shared it with you or the person that posted it. Can you have an offline conversation or a private online conversation? Because we know that these one-on-one dialogues make the broadest impact. Even though we would think you put it on social media and more people see it, that makes the impact. But it's so easy to just bypass. So can you even take the extra step to private message someone? Or if it's someone that you do engage with offline in real life, right? Have a conversation with them. Those are the meaningful moments right there.
So let's go to the younger members.
So the biggest challenge is TikTok. And I know we've all heard about it, and we're probably paying attention to the fact that, basically China has until January to no longer own it, or we are not going to provide it in the US anymore. And this generation, I think my college students, they're getting their social media news from TikTok. And I'm talking political science students who have taken classes with me for 4 years and who have heard this spiel and who have done the research, and they're still asking questions in class. Well, I saw on TikTok, blah, 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 blah. And I'm stopping them and saying, hold on a minute, just stop and see whether you think that makes sense based on what we've learned. And then they're like, oh, wait. And these are the most interested and knowledgeable students because it's easy to just passively get this information. And so it is a real challenge because they've grown up with social media and they want these quick hits. It's a real challenge to get them to take this extra step. They're the Chat GPT generation, right? They're the AI generation. And it is hard. It is a challenge. And so I do this with my daughters. I have two daughters that are 9 and 13. And we're having these conversations all the time about not taking these shortcuts in life and in knowledge gathering. But we also have to make it worth their while because they don't trust the government and they don't think they have a place in our democracy. And to some extent, I don't blame them because they're not told that they're a valued part of this democracy. And so we have to make them feel that their participation matters. And that will help them feel like that those extra steps are worthwhile. And it takes time and effort, and it's so hard, but it is so worth it.
So I had
How
my
do
hand
you?
up. This is Liz Crook. I had my hand up.
Oh, hi, Liz.
Hi, is it okay for me
Go
to
ahead,
interject?
Liz.
So I think that this pertains to adults also, and I've had conversations with acquaintances and friends who are in the exhaustion phase, but haven't even done any homework leading to the exhaustion. They've just been consuming.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we move those we're trying to educate into a daily routine where they can find reputable sources they trust and spend time learning? Because when I do give them factually based information, and I'll use a libertarian source because I figure, well, that's more moderate. So like Cato Institute, they're excellent because they'll argue both sides based on the facts.
That's right.
They don't want to engage because it takes too much effort.
Yeah.
How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I appreciate
And what is a normal amount of time that any adult who works should, that's a tough question, but
what's that sweet spot?
Do every day in order to accomplish being educated?
Yeah. No, Liz, thank you for the question. And I really appreciate the word used, fatigue, right? Because like our life is tiring, right? Just in general, right? But my students, they've been talking this week in particular, what they've called the fire hose. It's like a constant fire hose, right? We feel like water in the face every day. There's something new, right? 2 assassination attempts in 2 months, right? There's always something. The world is on fire. And for our young people, the world really feels on fire, right? And they're busier than ever and they're more stretched than ever, as is most of the US population, to be fair, right? So it's exhausting. Like living is exhausting, and living in this democracy is exhausting. And so I think your point is well taken about the fatigue. And when you do try to engage, there's a lot of resistance because it's too hard. And that's where those quick hits, are feel like enough. And so I often think a bit of it. I teach a class called Civic Wellbeing, and we talk about creating a practice of civic health, right? Like you practice any other type of well-being, or you like, how do you train a muscle? It's about creating a habit, right? How do you create a habit where it's part of your daily routine? And we do this with all other kinds of health. And so it's about finding ways to create habits of civic health that are not too time consuming, that are not too fatiguing, and that feel meaningful. And it looks a little different for everyone, because you also have to feel like it's useful, right? Like you have to be committed to creating the habit. And it says, what is the language that it takes 30 days to create a habit, right? Um, and so, of course, as an educator, part of what I say is like, this has to start, like my daughter's in 5th grade. Like this should have already started. This practice of civic health should have started already in the way her teachers talk to her about it. My 8th grader, same thing. We have to be better civic educators from the beginning. And we all, if I'm being very honest, like our responsibility as a sophisticated citizenry that are on this call, it's also our responsibility to be civic educators. And when we get this pushback of fatigue, is in try to engage in why they're fatigued and what can we do to encourage them to make these habits for themselves. It takes the talking to and the commitment to, and it's hard for us. It's exhausting for us as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Are there other sources that you would recommend as being reputable sources?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Cato, and are there others,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps one left-leaning, one right-leaning?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because not everyone is going to accept the New York Times or whatever you quote.
Right. Washington Post. Right. I mean, I have my online news sources that I trust and that I fact check, even when sometimes I'm like, that doesn't, especially the political scientist, I'm like, wait a minute, I don't know if that's correct. But what I do with my students, and what I would suggest as well, is that to stay away from those sort of hot focus flashpoint ones like New York Times, for example, right? So Cato Institute, Brookings Institute is also a really, really good one, run by academics, Brookings Institute. But I also recommend international sources like BBC World is great, really good. The international sources, even like CNN World, is better than our domestic CNN. But AP News, typically, especially international, Reuters, typically. I have like my more academic sources that are publicly accessible that I really like to use. But often those feel, especially because there's this pushback against higher ed, that if you're talking about, oh, this is an academic source, there's also hesitation there. And so if we're looking at mainstream sources, I really, really recommend like BBC World and other international sources. I see a hand, I think.
I would also like to recommend France 24,
Yes.
HKN, Deutsche Welle, international sources, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they're reporting, if we think about the audience, right? Like they're reporting to people in their country who need to know what's really going on in the US. It's not clickbait. They're not trying to fuel mis and disinformation narratives. They're not trying to divide, they're trying to explain. And that's what our media here should be doing. Yeah.
There's one comment related to Facebook. If you see a post that someone has put on your feed that you know to be false, you can hide the post.
Yes.
So other people don't see it.
Yes, that's a great point. You absolutely can.
So that's kind of a defensive measure while you look for a credible source that's acceptable to the poster, or have an offline conversation.
Absolutely. That's a great point, because if we don't want to add fuel to the outrage, right? And so if we can take something that others would see and make sure that they can't see it, that's our small part that's important.
Right.
Great point. Great point.
I like the idea you suggested of building a habit.
Mhm.
I was trying to use my phone to get an update every morning from news sources that
Yeah.
I trust.
Yeah. Yeah, we got to
So
work
I
out that
don't know if
muscle.
there's anything like that.
Yeah, that's
You know, a
yeah, that's a
place
good
that
point.
curates news that you could go to. Do you know
Yeah.
of any?
You know, it's such a good point. I know that I have an iPhone and I know we just got new iPhones and I know that there is some kind of there's a news feature I know for sure that will kind of send you news alerts. I haven't looked to see if you can customize from what sources or if it's like the Apple News, which is like its own thing. Um, and if you can kind of set it, you know, you have like there's the activity rings and the things that you have to track health, right? Like physical health, like you should stand up now, you should drink water now.
Yeah.
You should read the news now, right? Like, how do we create these reminders, especially for those of us where it's not top of mind? I have to set reminders for everything. Like, don't forget to pick your kids up. Like, I have to have reminders for everything. And so, why not something like making civic health a habit? Yeah.
Right. Well,
I
and
think there
when
was
I
a,
was
oh,
when you're
sorry, Elaine. I see
driving.
a, I see a hand up. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to cut
Oh,
you off, but I think, is it Tracy? I'm looking at the name. I saw a hand there.
Tracy,
Yes,
go ahead.
it is. And you know what? I raised my hand, but the hand is the
Oh, I
same as
see it now.
my peanut butter wall color. So
The same color. I see it now. Yeah,
I'm
yeah, sorry.
sorry.
I just
that's
took it
great.
down. It's okay. Okay, so I have a couple things. So clearly I violated something because so I had a cousin post something that was clearly false and she shared it, okay? And then I replied with an article. I believe my go-to is PBS because I feel like that's
Love it.
somebody that if I put something for Brookings, I don't think some of my family members would know what that is, but
Totally fair.
PBS, I feel like they think that is a trustworthy. So I posted it and she actually took down her post. But so you're saying I should not have replied to her?
Well, well, this is a great example where it worked, right? I wonder how many times that happens where someone takes something down, right? So I think you did the right thing, which was to do something, right? It's better
Okay.
than having done nothing. And I appreciate, always doing something, right? Again, I think, again, doing that is better than doing nothing. But I think if doing it in the future, if you can do a separate post so that no one looks at the other thing again, it's probably better. But I would just say, by and large, doing something, regardless of how you do it, is still the best way to go.
Okay. Because I guess I was also, because I am not friends with most of her friends on Facebook.
Oh, so maybe she could see it then. Sure.
So then her friends could read my comment too.
Mhm.
Like, okay, whether they read it or not. So part of me was thinking, because people are like, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, okay, no, no. And if I posted on my page, which I did, they aren't going to see it. So I'm, I don't know what, that's why I did it.
No,
But
and it makes sense. And the only other thing that you could have done again is you could have created create a separate post where you tagged her in something or you wrote to her, like,
okay,
and so
true.
everybody could still see it that she's friends with. And it's a new feed as opposed to the other one. But even still, you did the right thing, which was to nip the narrative in the bud. And you obviously it worked because she took down her post.
She did.
Yeah. Good on you. That's a win.
Well,
Kudos.
Yes.
I think that thankfully she realized she didn't know the whole story.
Right.
And, and then someone in the chat had mentioned about reaching out to young people.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that this disturbed me. I worked with a young, I say in his 30s, 32, Black man who was like, neither one of these candidates are going to help me. Obviously, this is before, when, it was Biden, but neither one of these candidates will help me, which is true. I mean, the Black people have not been helped in years. But he thought he would vote for Trump for the entertainment factor.
Oh,
Have any of you heard this? I'm like, that they thought that the presidential election was like an entertainment. And
like
I
a reality show.
absolutely. And I'm like, okay, that is not. So I'm hoping that he
that's a
is
one-off.
freak, he is a freak person that thinks, but that scared me. And I don't know if anyone else has heard that.
Yeah,
So.
that is horrifying. And I think my initial reaction to it is for Gen Z and very young millennials, politics, they've been socialized in an environment where politics feels like a joke. It does, right? It doesn't feel real in some ways. And a lot of people, particularly communities of color, feel completely locked out and excluded from the conversation. And so, and candidates and the parties are not speaking to them in meaningful ways. And so I'm not happy with what you just described, nor do I think that it's a useful way to exact one's citizenship. But I also kind of get it. For young people, for minoritized people, communities who've been locked out, they've only been socialized in a world where our politics feels like a joke. And so why not just watch it burn? I'm not agreeing with it. Please don't take my flip it to make that's what that is. But I kind of get it.
I mean, I got it when he told me, but I was like,
disturbing.
I would never vote like that.
No.
I would vote for somebody who says they're going to help Black people, So.
Right. I know, I hear you. And I think, again, part of this is we have to better the media, all of us have to do a better job of engaging people where they are to make them feel like their participation matters. It takes so much work. We have to do it.
A positive note, even though it's another terrifying trend, the gun violence at the Parkman High School, those young people were not involved at all before something happened that really impacted them. And they decided to become advocates and go across the country and raise money to do that, to travel. So they're, sometimes it takes something that really affects you. And another issue would be climate change.
Yes,
now,
for young
Liz
people in particular.
Has her hand up again. Go ahead, Liz. Oops.
Oh, I think you muted yourself rather than the opposite.
Sorry. Do you have any tips to teach people how to moderate their anger when they're seeing things that are just so they sow more distrust? So a good example would be the way the news media, and I watch PBS, even interviews, and sometimes they'll be really aggressive towards a person that they've brought on to try and get them to commit to agree with their position on it. So a good example was today, they were interviewing the governor from Ohio, and the question was, Trump has said blah, 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 Vance has said blah, blah, blah. Don't you feel that this breeds violence? And they really wanted him to just say, yes, it does. And of course, he's not going to. So how to navigate the lack of commitment by numerous politicians on both sides to not call a spade because of possible loss of their powerful positions, but also sowing misinformation in response to some of these black and white questions. How do you navigate all the emotions that come from that and the option to just disconnect and click off, which is what a lot of young people do?
Yeah, no, thank you. And young people, young people, yes, but it's the fatigue again, right? Like we were talking about. And again, politics is an emotional process, particularly if you're in a community that's under attack, right? So, especially since 2022 and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, women have felt under attack, and the continued attack on people of color. I mean, there's communities all over the country that are feeling under attack all the time, and they really just want a politician to meaningfully answer a question and say that this is what's happening. And they're unwilling to do that. And so when there's this unwillingness to take responsibility and to say the hard thing that's right, we get mad, and we should, right? So I say this to students often, is that we have two options when we feel that emotion, right? The anxiety, the fear, the anger that's either activated on purpose to divide, or because we're so committed and feel so deeply that we're just so angry at how things are happening, that we can either be so angry that we tune out or we lean in further. And so the question I think I hear you saying, Liz, is how do we get them to lean in further? And I would say just two things about this. One of which is, if there are people in this country whose just mere existence is a political act. They're exhausted every day by just existing in a democracy that doesn't serve them. And so I give them, what I say to students in particular is like, you get to decide when you dip in and dip out for yourself, because this is not always a space where you feel like you can be in. And then when they take that time, often it's about finding ways to re-enter. And it's our job to help them figure out where those spaces are that they can re-enter. And it looks different for everyone, right? There's no like blanket answer. But what I have said, what I say over and over again to students, and I will say now, is that we have to demand better. We have not incentivized elected officials to give us anything different than they've already given us. And they benefit from it. So we have to have like a massive, widespread social movement where we demand better. And we know that the best generation to do that is the youngest generation. And we just have to keep telling them that it's important that they participate, but let them take the space and time when they're exhausted. I know it's not the perfect answer, because there's no perfect answer.
That helps a lot, especially steering them to spaces that they may feel safe in. That's a really great phrase. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
There are a couple comments in the chat regarding resources. Gabe Fleischer on NPR has a daily newsletter, Wake Up to Politics, and on Fridays he features what Congress has accomplished,
which is usually very little.
Yeah. Anyway,
I did just notice that someone mentioned,
and Heather Richardson is another that relates current events to the history gone before. It helps you understand. Yeah.
Yes, I am a big fangirl. I adore her, and she writes so accessibly and doesn't pull punches. Big fan of Heather Cox Richardson. Yeah, love that.
And Marty Sladek made the comment, no, pick your battles. Don't get into a hissing match with a snake.
So true. So true. I think
and also remember, if you're talking to young people about voting, there are other people on the ballot besides the president. So you do need to vote for all the local people, which includes judges, county officials, they handle services and budgeting and taxes.
Absolutely. Love it. I think, does
Diane, go ahead.
Oh, I can second, third, fourth, whatever, Heather Cox Richardson. And I was introduced to her by a solidly lifetime Republican tax attorney and accountant who posted at one point, he said, I've changed my mind. I'm not voting Republican this time. Listen to Heather Cox Richardson. She's got a brain. She knows what she's talking about. If you can get someone to get through her American Paradox series of 9 podcasts, blogs, Slack, whatever it is, it gives you people a background for how we got to where we are and why much of this talk about who Republicans are and who Democrats are and who's wanting to do what is actually disinformation. It's not really quite true. So she's great. I will also say, however, that I don't remember, I said something to a friend of mine, an attorney friend of mine, about, I was listening to Hidden Brain on NPR, and oh my goodness, NPR is a trigger. Don't try to convince any hard right person that you got something from NPR or PBS. That's PBS. That's really one of those triggers.
They lump that with NPR. NPR, I see, I understand, but they lump together PBS with NPR?
Well, she did. I have no idea. Her
Yeah.
comment was, "Oh, I don't know. I'm going to have to go get these papers for you because I can't believe that an intelligent person would blah, 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 blah." And she went on. So, I will say, however, that my historian son is really good. We just had a conversation this weekend because I was visiting at finding statistics because we were talking about how Kamala Harris has been branded Biden's failed border czar. She was never a border czar. That is a falsehood. And all she was supposed to do was to visit the countries in Central, South America,
Right.
Central America, actually, who had problems, and therefore their citizens were fleeing. And so he pulls up statistics and says, and so in such and such a year, they were counting these nationalities at the border, and there were 700,000. Now, this past year, well, 2023, because they don't have the statistics, and these are coming from the government, labor statistics and immigration statistics. Now there are 500,000 that are, I believe it was Nicaraguan, Guatemalan, and Panamanian, those three countries. So you can find these statistics. You can find them. CBS News, I'm going to have to go see if I have it on my, find it on television. CBS Sunday Morning.
Love that show. Love that show.
Had a program, and I took some pictures of the charts and the graphs to review them, because they were taking these statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They were taking them not from news sources at all, and showing that, no, indeed, inflation is down to the level it was before. And all of this talk about, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? If you go to the statistics that are being provided by supposedly nonpartisan, now, of course, I can hear my as my brother calls them, the creationists, the Christian nationalists next door, and they'll say, oh, well, the government is biased too. There's an answer for everything.
Us fake numbers.
And there is a point where you say, those are the people who are calcified, and there is no reason to waste time talking to those people. You can do a pushback, but talk to people who are still not in the cult, who are still, I don't know. And so I'm trying to take that to heart. But there are statistics out there to counteract some of this.
And all of that. Yeah, Cynthia, thank you so much. I'm sorry, excuse me, Diane, thank you so much. I'm a data person. I'm a statistician. I love me some data, as you saw from the presentation. And we know where to get it, and we know how to use it, and we know how to report on it. And one of the most difficult things, and something I work through in classes, and we're working through it at the campus with our new data science minor, is, and there's been some interesting research in political science about the manipulation of data to create data visuals, the data visualization that does not accurately represent the data, right? So how can you take data that are factual, but how do you represent it in a visual way that skews what it actually says? So it's true, but it's not. And there is a responsibility for those who work in data visualization and data science, just like there's a responsibility for journalists, because most of us are seeing infographics, right? We're not reading stories, we're looking at infographics, and especially in social media. And the manipulation of those data is in some ways almost more dangerous than just the news stories that are coming out, because it's a quick hit, and we have to be better. We just do.
When they do that, are they quoting the source at the bottom? So you believe it's an accurate portrayal.
That's right. And sometimes it really is just someone who didn't understand the data and know how to put it together, and it's like a straight up accident, and it's unintentional. And they typically will make a new graph and retract and so forth, if anyone ever reads that. But it's those who are manipulating on purpose and know what the data say, but are mining it in a way to create a narrative that isn't true. That's what's really, really difficult. And this is why people don't trust data. And again, as someone who uses data, like this has made my job so much harder. So much harder. Yeah.
Well, we have run out of our time. Whoops, we might have one more question.
I see. And if it's another Suzanne, I'm definitely interested in hearing what she has to say.
Susie.
I know. I'm wondering if it's a nickname.
Thank you. Yeah, it's from Susan Internet.
Oh, wait, you just muted yourself on accident. Or maybe I don't think it was perfect. There we go.
Thank you. The whole idea of showing numbers deceptively is an old practice. Excuse me. I remember reading a book years and years ago where it talks about showing only the narrow range of numbers where you actually have some data, cutting off the bottom, cutting off the top, which magnifies the difference between. You can also change scales. There are a lot of ways, and it's really important to try to understand and get comfortable with numbers. A lot of people, especially those who don't have STEM backgrounds, a lot of people are not comfortable with numbers and they fall into these traps. It's really important to demystify it and realize that numbers were invented by people and anybody can become comfortable and competent. Read John Allen Polos about numeracy, innumeracy. He's a mathematician who has done a great job of writing about general discomfort with numbers, P-O-U or P-A-U or O-U-L-O-S, University of Pennsylvania. His stuff is old, but it's still very, very good. Recommended highly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not familiar with him. I'm going to look that up for sure.
Oh, God. Read him. You might have to get it used, but get it new if you can, because you should support him. But get it.
He's at Temple. He's at Temple, it looks like.
Temple? Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
Who's counting? I'm looking it up right now. Yeah.
Oh, he's written half a dozen really
yeah.
His first book
was Innumeracy. I see
Innumeracy, where he talks about how people are so uncomfortable with quantities and don't understand magnitudes. He's marvelous. Read him.
I see a book, A Mathematician Reads the Newspaper.
That too. That's one of his, that was after several years.
This is fabulous. Thank you, Susie, so much. I can't wait to get a hold of these.
Yes, and you're an academic. You could probably even meet him. He's wonderful.
I can definitely get the books for free. I'll start there and then we'll see.
Well, pay him because he's worth it.
Oh, he'll be worth a speaking fee. I just need some free books, right? I don't get paid enough for all the books I want to buy.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We've oh my gosh, I kept you all so late.
It's okay. This is a very big interest of all of us, and certainly timely for the election and talking to people. One of the most important ways, like you mentioned, was having offline conversations, with people or people that you're acquainted with. They already know you and they might accept what you're telling them and think about it and change their minds. So that is probably one of the more effective ways to change people's direction or leaning.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for spending the time again. This always is a very, very, very interesting topic. And I don't know if you want to stay on, if anybody else wants to stay on, but we'll officially end our webinar. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And remember, do we have one more question? I thought I heard. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. And a big thank you to Suzanne for spending the part of the evening with us.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. Really do. Hopefully